I'm going to go ahead and introduce Lori McPherson. She's a senior policy advisor with the Sex Offender Investigations Branch of the U.S. Marshals Service. She served as a special advisor to the executive director of the White House Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons, Operation Lady Justice, and currently serves on the Department of Justice's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Steering Committee. Prior to her time with USMS, she worked for over 10 years at the SMART Office, DOJ, for 2 years heading up the Child Sexual Exploitation Program for the National District Attorneys Association, 5 years as a local prosecutor in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and 5 years before that as a local public defender. She has been licensed to practice law in the Commonwealth of Virginia since 1996. And joining Lori will be Sarah Blazucki is co-author with Lori McPherson of the recently published article about MMIP. Statistics are human beings with the tears wiped away, utilizing data to develop strategies to reduce the number of Native Americans who go missing. Sarah has a background in communications and recently embarked on a legal career and currently works for a federal agency. Prior to entering the legal field, she handled communications for the Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking, DOJ SMART Office. In that position, Sarah was tapped to support the White House Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons, Operation Lady Justice. Before SMART, she was the agency editor for the Peace Corps. Prior to working for the federal government, she was an editor of an LGBTQ newspaper. Sarah is a member of the DC Bar. So, welcome, Lori and Sarah. Always great to have you. This is Lori. We've been fortunate enough to have Lori speak on every one of our symposiums. Hopefully we can continue the tradition, Lori.
One of these days I will get out there.
That'd be great. Yeah. Well, feel free to go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
I'm going to go ahead and start. And before I pull up my PowerPoint, I want to thank you, first of all, for having me again as a presenter. My co-author, Sarah Blazucki, will be hopping on shortly. We had a little bit of moving around of our presentation time, and so she's ready and will be here in a few minutes. Let me start off with just introducing myself and letting you know a little bit about why I'm interested in this topic, why I stay involved in this topic. I'm a white person of Western and Northern European descent, and I'm not affiliated with any tribe. I'm not a member of any tribe. But there are really three big reasons why I'm invested in this work and stay involved in this work. And the first is that it's I'm not going to say a lot of folks talk about this, but at least on kind of my side, but I really do believe in the treaty responsibilities of the federal government to American Indian and Alaska Native folks. And that's something I'm really committed to in my professional life, and to become a student of how the law and how law enforcement interacts in Indian country. Second, over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, I've had the opportunity to work in Indian country all over the United States, from Metlakatla up in Alaska, over to St. Regis Mohawk, down to Tohono O'odham, Oklahoma, Montana. I was just on Pine Ridge last week, and I've developed kind of a world of relationships in the course of that work, and have really become connected to some of the people and some of the communities through those folks. And it's part of the driving force of why I stay involved in the work. And then thirdly, I'm a member of two different communities where the risk factors and the experience and the life experience of folks who either have gone missing or have disappeared or may have been vulnerable to violence was really real. I was a young, active alcoholic. I got sober when I was 21 years old back in 1993. And, during that active alcoholism and that active drinking, I certainly was in positions where I could have been one of those people who went missing or experienced violent victimization in a way that it resulted in my death. And so Personally, I'm familiar with how that might work. And in my sober communities, there are definitely people who've been through experiences like that. And then I've been a member of the queer community, I don't know what else to call it, since 1995. And as a member of that community, same thing. A lot of people I love dearly have been through experiences where they could have been that person, or they were that person who disappeared or experienced violent victimization as a result of being in that marginalized community. And so those are the things that motivate me on this. So what we're going to do, and I switched it around so that when Sarah's able to hop on, she'll be able to present on her piece. What Sarah and I did was we both worked on Operation Lady Justice, and through the course of that work, we learned so much about the public health approach to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous persons. And honestly, I'm a career criminal justice person. I became sold on that approach to this particular topic. And honestly, we could talk about how it could be a potential solution for all kinds of criminal justice issues that are out there. And we wanted to put in one place, in one article, kind of the argument for utilizing that kind of public health approach when we're talking about MMIP. The previous speaker was fantastic, and she touched on a number of the things that we touched on. She touched on them in a much more eloquent and knowledgeable way, I think, than I'd be able to speak on them, but it dovetails. It absolutely dovetails. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right, I really appreciate it. This was our thesis on this piece, then it looks like Sarah just joined us. So before I even get started, Sarah, since you're on, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we can take it from there. All right. If the tech folks could work with Sarah so that we can hear her, I'll just go ahead.
I don't see an additional person that's signed on to Zoom.
Okay. You may need to, and I apologize everybody for doing this out in the open in front of everyone. You may need to send her that panelist link so that she can sign on through that. I'm just going to keep talking, and I trust that the tech folks can work this out. So this was the thesis that we went with, that it is possible to reduce the number of American Indian Alaska Native persons who go missing, and to reduce the amount of time that they are gone. Do we have it squared away, tech folks?
Is the person's name Sarah Blazucki?
Blazucki, yes.
Okay, I'm going to turn her into a panelist right now.
Okay. All right, let's pause so that she can do her intro. The joys of Zooming, everybody.
See how that works.
Yeah, it should.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and see.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you all for this. Apologies for the technical difficulties on that. I'm Sarah Blazucki, and I've been a colleague of Laura McPherson for a few years. And we worked together at the SMART office at the Department of Justice. And then we also worked on the Operation Lady Justice work. And I think that's how we got hooked into this particular topic in this particular way. For myself, let's see the short version. I'm a recent JD graduate. I have a background in communications, and that's actually how I became involved and interested in Native American issues, is through the Native American Journalists Association and working with the journalists that I met there from a background in communications and journalism, and then gaining more knowledge and insight and interest in the more difficult topics, such as the missing and murdered Indigenous persons topic. And I think if we're ready to launch in, we can launch in.
We'll launch in, and we'll have Sarah start off, and then you can just hand it back to me when you're done. So hang on just a
We are
second.
currently not sharing a screen.
That's, yes, we will be shortly though.
Okay.
So, my gosh. Try it a couple of times so it can see my PowerPoint when I go to share. There we go. All right. All right, so can you see that, Sarah?
It's in slide sorter mode right now instead of slideshow view mode.
One more time. There we go. There we go. All right.
Looks good.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sounds good. Thank you. So we're going to start with, depending on your perspective, this might be the more scintillating part of the presentation, or maybe not so scintillating, but we shall see. So we're going to start with the legal issues and some of the nuances around missing and murdered individuals and the legal issues involved there. Lori, go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing to really think about and remember, and this is not specific to Native American populations, but this is across the board, is that there's no duty to investigate. So there's no duty for the government, for law enforcement, to actually investigate a particular case, asterisk there, in the absence of a special relationship. And that's actually fairly narrowly defined. So it really needs to be like a individual promise. And that's actually what the court used, was the term promise. But if there's no promise for assistance to an individual actual person, then there's no responsibility. So under 42 USC 1983, there can be liability for a government actor, but in many cases, what courts have found is that there's no liability for failure to investigate or for failure to protect individuals. So there's numerous cases that have happened where police have, where family has gone to report someone as missing and police have not investigated. And numerous cases, these here, the individual was murdered. And so the family brought a case under 42 USC 1983 to say that that the police had liability and they should have investigated and they should have taken a police report. They should have done something. And the courts have found that there was no responsibility because there was no special relationship. So, in the case where there was a relationship was a case where a woman had called 911 and the dispatcher took the call and said, police would be on their way, but then determined incorrectly that it was a prank call. And so the woman was actually, she was killed. And then there was, in that very narrow instance, then there was liability. But in these particular cases here, there wasn't. And so, the cases are really heartbreaking, but, there are assumptions by law enforcement that someone's a runaway. And so they didn't investigate the situation, or if they thought that someone had substance abuse issues and that they were an alcoholic or on a drug binge of some sort, then the police didn't investigate. They dismissed it and didn't take it seriously. And sometimes police have been reluctant just in general to take missing persons reports for adults. And so there's issues around that. So in the case of Ramona Moore, police didn't take the report for 4 days, and then she was found kidnapped and murdered. They're really heartbreaking cases. So point of that, no duty to investigate on law enforcement's part. So framing it out that way. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then the next thing to think about is the limitation of federal power and what the federal government is limited in what it can compel states to do. So under the Constitution, the federal government has enumerated powers, and powers that are not granted to the federal government are left to the states. And so limitations on what states, on what the federal government can require states to do. So one of the things that's a question mark is whether the federal government can compel states to collect and share criminal history data. It's an unanswered question at this point. The Supreme Court hasn't ruled, so it's a question. There is a federal mandate on states to submit data on missing persons who are under 21, but that does not actually apply to tribes. That mandate does not extend to tribes. And there's actually no federal mandate to submit data on any other missing persons. It's only under 21, so missing children. That said, the federal government may have broader authority to compel tribes to collect and submit missing persons data, but it has not taken steps to do so. Next slide, please. So under the Indian Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, Congress has been granted plenary powers over tribal affairs. So if Congress wanted to, and if it specifically said so, if it speaks clearly, then it can compel tribes in certain ways. This authority is generally delegated to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Interior, and to the Indian Health Service under Department of Health and Human Services. In the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, there's the Office of Justice Services, so BIA OJS. It was created in 1990, and it is responsible for carrying out law enforcement functions of the Secretary of the Interior in Indian country. A caveat there is that there's no broad authority for BIA to enforce laws outside of Indian country, even when the victim is Native American or Alaska Native, or if a Native American, Alaska Native person has gone missing. And so BIA depends on an invitation and cooperation from local law enforcement for investigations on non-tribal lands. Next slide, please. Now here, the tribes do retain policing power. So they can pass and they can enforce their own criminal and civil laws. There's some, well, there's a lot of caveats and asterisks there. There's like 12 asterisks there. But states and localities sometimes have concurring policing powers, and then there's concurring jurisdictional issues with the federal government. Lots of asterisks. It's a complicated structure, but for the tribal structure specifically, there's 3 basic structures for law enforcement, and that's self-funded, where the tribe pays for its own policing law enforcement agencies. There are direct law enforcement services from BIA OJS, and that's where the law enforcement officers are federal employees. There are also 638 contracts, and in 638 contracts, law enforcement officers are tribal employees, a little bit of a different structure. And so in missing person cases, in absence of cross-deputization agreements, the 3 types of tribal law enforcement are limited to operating on their own tribal lands, which, as you can imagine, can be quite limiting in missing persons cases, where someone is taken off of tribal lands, or if they were not on tribal lands when they were abducted or went missing. Next slide, please. So as a general matter, everyone has a right to privacy and a right to be forgotten. So this intersects with missing persons cases in the sense that adults generally have a right to go missing without interference from law enforcement. So if there's no indication of criminality, a risk of danger of the person to themselves or someone else, then law enforcement don't have an obligation to get involved. And if someone wants to go missing, if they're an adult and they can make that decision, they can. So it's not a crime for an adult to intentionally disappear. And people can disappear for myriad reasons. It can be financial issues, it can be intimate partner violence. They might want to leave a situation, they're in a difficult situation, they might want to leave that situation and not let anyone know where they're going for their own safety, for the safety of family members. And so in that situation, it's not a crime. So someone can be reported missing, but if there's no reason that it's not criminality, it's not risk, it's not danger, then it's not a crime. There's also protections under the Fourth Amendment. So the right to be free from unreasonable surveillance and data mining and information tracking. So thinking about search and seizure. And so when you're thinking about this, like, do police have, law enforcement, do they have the authority, do they have the powers to track someone or to investigate them? And the courts have said generally no. You know, sort of depending on the situation and the facts at hand, things like if you, if it's information that's out in the public or you have been out in the public, say it's your car, then depending on the level of surveillance, it may or may not be acceptable. So if it's putting a tracking device on your vehicle and tracking you for 30 days, the court has said that that's too much, that level of surveillance is unreasonable. And so you have protections. It does get a little, it's been evolving when it comes to things like cell phone tracking and what's allowed and what the courts have said that law enforcement can do with regard to that as far as tracking individual people and looking at the data from third-party actors, third-party companies. So like your phone company, can they provide that data to law enforcement? Often the answer is yes. So next slide, please. So under the right to privacy and the right to be forgotten, there is a theory that was established as early as 1890 about the right to be let alone and the right to not have government tracking you, government being involved in your business. And so, what does that look like? It's not enumerated and technically spelled out in the Constitution. So this is a right that's a little more squishy and a little not as clearly defined as some might like. And so, the court can also chip away at it as they have done recently. So there's a limited right to privacy there, but there's certainly the idea and what courts have sometimes found and then sometimes contracted about that. When it comes to informational privacy, the courts have said that there's on personal matters, there should be a reasonable expectation of confidentiality. So your papers and your personal information, you should have a right to confidentiality and an expectation of privacy in that. So, if you have, and this is, thinking from where this evolved from, we're talking about physical papers, we're talking about your diary, things like that, and hard copies. And where that comes from, you can think about things that might be embarrassing and something that you might not want someone else to know about you. And then you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that information. What that translates to is to medical information, employment information, victims of crime, what that looks like for them. This does start to get different, and it starts to get naughty when it moves into, when you think about electronic information and information privacy on the internet, data privacy, and those evolving issues. Next slide, please. And so information privacy law, spoiler alert, the United States doesn't do a great job. That's really the quick and dirty on that. So the traditional idea of where information privacy comes from is that an individual can prevent disclosure of sensitive or confidential information that can cause embarrassment or harm. So, you could think about family information, about, a child out of wedlock or divorce or something sort of historical that would be embarrassing. And if you'd want to have that information public or not. And so, that's a personal decision on whether you'd want that shared. If you have a type of disability or medical issues, if you'd want that shared or not. When it's moving into data protection, then you start to think about information that is routinely exposed to the public and whether you have a privacy interest in that or not. Because if it's easily found, if it's something that you easily share, and it's routinely exposed, then you probably have limited protection on that. So thinking about, your name and maybe your address. But then if you start to layer information on that, so if you add your birth date and you add your social security number, what does that look like? How's that exposed? Your banking information or your phone number, those are quite different. So you might share your phone number or an email address, but you're probably not going to share your banking information. And in the United States, at least, data protection is governed sector by sector. So if you think about medical information and you think about HIPAA, the protections there, you think about consumer data, you think about financial data, it's a little different than, say, Europe, which has much broader data protection laws and it's across the board. So that's a little different. And how that intersects with missing persons is that individuals reported missing to law enforcement may have a privacy interest in that information. So, if you go back to the scenario where someone has intentionally gone missing and disappeared of their own volition and their own choice, do they have an interest in making sure that that information stays private if that's what they were intending? Or if they were erroneously reported missing, they probably have a right to have any missing person information removed and cleared from a database. So this could apply to nonprofit organizations and others. There potentially could be civil liability, and plug there, consult your general counsel, consult your lawyer on that information, like sort of guidance on that. So what's shared and how public that information is, and if there's privacy interest there. Next slide, please.
All right. Let me pause for a second and ask, since I know Sarah needs to jump off at some point here, would this be a good time for questions for you, Sarah, or do you want to hang on till 6:30?
Either way.
Okay. All right.
I'm just going to go ahead.
Yeah, let's just keep it going, and we'll take questions at the end. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the criminal justice data we have about missing and murdered Indigenous persons, and then about some of the research that's been done into what the drivers are for folks who go missing, especially children who go missing, and then talk a little bit about possible solutions, possible interventions and preventions, much like our previous speaker was talking about. So we just got in the last couple of weeks the data for 2023 from the FBI, and the FBI gathers the official missing persons data nationwide. That's who law enforcement is required to submit that information to. And they do submit that information. They're required to for any person who goes missing who's under the age of 21. And so you can see from this chart that the number has stayed relatively constant, right around that 10,000 mark. The range has been between 9,500 and about 10,500 over the course of the last 16 years, 17 years for the number of American Indian Alaska Native folks who are reported missing every year. And that's just to give you a framework. The total number of folks who are reported missing every year is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 550,000. But this is the number as it applies to Native communities. Now, these statistics, these are also new, and there's a typo in here. This should be for 2023. This is just to highlight that the vast majority of people who are reported missing who are American Indian Alaska Native are what we would consider those endangered runaways. And, runaway is a problematic term, but those teenagers between the ages of 12 and 17 is the vast majority of people who are reported missing. And that holds true for missing kids, for boys and for girls. You can see that the number of kids who go missing who are under the age of 12 is a very small percentage compared to that much larger percentage in the teenage range. And this is from 2023. This is the most recent information we have. And you can see that that holds true for girls and for boys. So this is these are the numbers for girls who are reported missing, American Indian Alaska Native girls. 71% of women and girls who are reported missing are between the ages of 12 and 17. And then this year was a little bit lower for boys. About 60% of missing American Indian Alaska Native males are that 12 to 17 age range. And so when we're looking at the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, particularly missing folks, the United States Marshal Service has really focused in on this 12-year-old to 17-year-old range. We do have a small missing child unit that does assist in investigations of missing children. And so that's the age range that we have really focused on as an agency. So part of the research that Sarah and I did, we wanted to look into, not only why do kids go missing, but why do American Indian Alaska Native children go missing, with an eye towards, it's one thing and it's necessary to be able to accurately capture the data about how many kids go missing and to really work hard on making sure that that information gets into criminal justice databases and gets to the FBI and gets to places where we can really document the scope and the size of the problem. But it would be even better if the kids didn't go missing. So it's really taking that both and approach. I promise we did not coordinate with the previous speaker. There are a number of different factors that go into why kids go missing, and particular to Native kids, there's historical trauma. And you've heard about that today, and I am certainly not the expert. I don't have the lived experience with that, but everybody's familiar with what that historical trauma is and that ongoing historical trauma is. And it's not just for the fact that the trauma occurred that we want to pay attention to it, but the ongoing impact that it has on communities. And one of the proxies we looked at, and this is not a perfect proxy measure, but when you look at adverse childhood experiences, American Indian Alaska Native kids experience the highest average of ACEs among any racial or ethnic group. And for me, that's just one indicator of the impact of historical trauma on Native communities and how it impacts this issue of MMIP. So what we did was we took a look at the broad research applying to all groups about why kids run away, and then cross-checked that with research as to those particular issues when it comes to Native communities. And so first we looked at systematic and community factors, and what the research shows is that kids are more likely to run away from home or to leave home if they experience poverty or economic insecurity. And so looking at Native communities, we know that about a fifth of American Indian Alaska Native folks live under the poverty level, and that they're the most disproportionately overrepresented group in poverty. And so this highlights, and a lot of this research highlights, how important it is to really be mindful of and familiar with what communities look like at the local level, at the ground level. Not every Native community is poor, but in those places where Native communities do have high levels of poverty, that's going to increase the risk factor for kids leaving home. We also know that kids are likely to run away if they are disengaged from school. And we know that American and Alaska Native students have higher dropout rates and lower levels of school connectedness than any other race or ethnicity. The Bureau of Indian Education has a ton of issues. High school graduation rates are low compared to other racial groups. So again, it's that loop where the community is under-resourced, the schools are under-resourced, the kids become disengaged, and then because they become disengaged, they become more likely to run away from home and start that trauma cycle. And then we know that kids are more likely to run away if they experience being in the foster care system. And there are entire multi-day classes, semester-long classes about ICWA and the issues that come up with ICWA, but we do know that Native kids are placed in foster care at a rate double those of white kids. And that, again, it just feeds that loop. More systematic and community factors to look at. And some of the research on kids who go missing kind of merges into and sometimes gets messy in the research dealing with homeless youth. There's some overlap there that's really difficult to disentangle. So some of the research around youth homelessness, I think, really can apply when we look at kids under 18 who take off. First of all, when there's lack of access to affordable health care, it can be an issue leading to higher risks of suicide or homelessness. Just like BIE, we could have a semester-long class about the issues with Indian Health Services of political importance right now. And this is without, with my federal government hat on, is without taking a position on it. The Hyde Amendment does limit Indian Health Services and the reproductive health care and the abortion services they can provide. And so, that's an avenue of research of, what kind of impact does that kind of limitation of care have on kids who are living in places where the only available healthcare is through Indian Health Services, and does that drive them to leave home? Same thing with gender affirming care. It's only been in recent years that IHS has started to get on board with gender affirming care. I don't think it's universal yet. And also understanding for our American and Alaska Native folks who live in urban communities in the states that have banned gender affirming care or banned abortion services, what kind of driver is that to leave home? And then criminal activity, trafficking gets a lot of attention, and like our previous speaker mentioned, that's the fear that's out there, is that folks will get immediately trafficked if they end up leaving home. And the research honestly isn't clear as far as where that criminal activity sits as far as causing somebody to leave home, because in other words, it's voluntary and that they want to, contributing to them staying missing. In other words, they get, they get involved in it and persisting. So that's the language that I've used for is just, does it cause it? Does it contribute to it? Or does it persist it and persist the amount of time that they're gone? And really pulling that apart hasn't been done yet. And looking at the number of boys who go missing, we don't want to gender stereotype the risk to kids who go missing and paint the picture that only girls who go missing or women who go missing are vulnerable. Our boys and our men are also vulnerable. Their vulnerabilities will look different in some places, but the vulnerability to gang and or trafficking activity is real for boys and girls who go missing. All right, looking at home-based factors, kids are more likely to run away if they experience family conflict or abuse or neglect or violence in the home. And just like those other factors that we talked about, American Indian Alaska Native kids are experiencing really high rates of abuse and neglect. They are experiencing greater rates of witnessing violence in the home and parental substance abuse. And there's so much full circle activity happening here. There's higher rates of incarceration for American Indian Alaska Native folks, and the kids see that incarceration, and then the witnessing of that increases the kids' risk of taking off from home, and there's just this huge cycle, and it's tough to pull apart, but it's really important to look at all of those factors as we're taking a comprehensive approach. And ACF's MMIP plan is fantastic. The NIAC recommendations are really good, and they get at some of this. And then parental neglect or sexual abuse can put kids at higher risk if they do leave home for more negative consequences when they're out. And they may leave home sooner and be more likely to experience victimization. Relational factors, and this is across the board. A kid who's dating a much older peer is at higher risk of leaving home, and with some caveats, they're at a higher risk of violence if they're a teenager dating someone who's a couple years older than them. And we're all familiar with the higher levels of dating violence and sexual violence among American Indian Alaska Native students. So again, it's just this cycle, and looking for places to intervene and looking for places to break that cycle. Personal factors, substance abuse issues, mental health issues, the higher rates of controlled substance use, higher rates of depression and anxiety, triple the suicide rate of the next highest racial group. I mean, these are all significant issues in Native communities. This all just builds on one another, and prevention and intervention really is the key. And like our previous speaker said, and I'll reference in a little bit, culture as prevention is what's unique to American Indian Alaska Native communities compared to other racial groups. All right, the consequences of going missing. What we know about kids who go missing, and this is just generally speaking, this is not detailed to Native kids, is that most are gone for less than a week and they stay within about 50 miles at home. But the asterisk on that is that kids who go missing for longer than that or travel farther from home than that are more likely to have a history of abuse in the home. So again, just that cycle and looking for places to intervene. We know, and this is the fear, right, is that even a short period of time out of the home can exacerbate problems that cause the kid to leave home in the first place. And you can think of a dozen different ways that can happen. If they've got a substance abuse problems, the odds are they are not getting sober when they leave home. If they have mental health issues, they may not have access to their medication. If they're disengaged from school, they're probably not going to school at all. So again, that cycle perpetuates. When kids are gone, they're more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. They're more likely to be exploited or victimized by others, and more likely to resort to those illicit and dangerous activities to secure basic necessities, things like survival sex or any number of things in order to get their basic needs of food and shelter taken care of. And it's this layering of negative experiences while the kids are gone on top of the conditions that drove the kid to leave in the first place that makes things just so much harder, even when they come back. And the important thing for us on the law enforcement side is that there's no safe amount of time a kid can be missing before they're going to be susceptible to these adverse outcomes. And the point that Sarah made is really important, that law enforcement is not legally required to, and this is going to sound awful, but they're not legally required to investigate missing child cases. They're not legally required to investigate missing persons cases. And that's why I think that's where a lot of the frustration comes from, is in the communities, no matter who it is that, folks just want their cases investigated and investigated well and investigated fast. And what we've ended up having to do in most missing persons cases and missing child cases is we have to be persuasive. We have to persuade law enforcement, whether it's local law, it's usually local law enforcement, state law enforcement, federal law enforcement, essentially to do their jobs and to look for kids who go missing instead of just taking the report and putting it on the shelf. And that's why you see so many working groups and so many task forces and so many efforts to persuade politicians to put the pressure on law enforcement to actually investigate the cases. And that's part of what we do at the Marshal Service, is we actively investigate missing child cases. We've been involved in the recovery of, I don't want to overstate it, but I'd say at least 4, 5, 6 in the last year or so, Native American Indian kids who we've assisted in the recovery of those kids. And that's what it's all about, is getting those kids home and getting them safe. All right, this is what you heard from the previous speaker, and I'm glad I only spent one slide on it because she did a fabulous job talking about it. But when we're looking at preventing kids from going missing, that's the idea, right? We don't want these kids to be at any more risk than they're already at. We know that, most of the times it is less safe to be out of the home than it is to be in the home. Of course, the asterisk is on that is that sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's the best possible thing that kid can do to get out of the house. But looking at the bulk of the cases where the kid's at more risk being out than being in, what can we do to prevent kids from going missing in the first place? And I threw this all on one slide, and our previous speaker covered so much of this. So what we did was we pulled together some of the solutions that the field has suggested. So advocates, community organizers, academics, nonprofits, folks who are working in this field, and the suggestions on solutions as they apply to each of those factors that drive kids to go missing, specific to American Indian, Alaska Native communities. So addressing historical trauma, and we see this in different places and different folks working on it. Restoring tribal lands, removing barriers to land transfers within tribal communities. The federal government and state governments' acceptance of responsibility for historical wrongs and acknowledgement and support of tribal sovereignty. All of these address that driver that we see from historical trauma. Looking at systemic or community factors, this is where budgets, they are not exciting, but they drive so much of what we do. The way to address those systematic and community factors that drive kids to go missing is to fully support and invest, community infrastructure for tribes, fully support and invest in job creation, food security, healthcare, mental health care, housing, access to capital, efforts to reduce inflation and wage gaps. All of those things will support communities in such a way that kids will be less likely to go missing. Those home-based factors right along the same line, developing and supporting prevention initiatives around child abuse and neglect, around intimate partner violence and sexual abuse, alternatives to incarceration, relational factors, same thing, investing in healthy dating programs to reduce IPV, and then those personal factors. And all of these could have the cultural competent caveat in front of them, because like your previous speaker said, you know, one of the biggest strengths of Indian country is the culture that holds communities together, and having access to culturally competent support and investment, as well as care, and in this case for drug and alcohol abuse, mental health issues, suicide prevention, all of that will support the community in such a way that families are supported, kids are supported. And when those families are supported and the kids are supported, they're less likely to put themselves at risk by taking off. And a lot of this is in the NIAC report. They got at a lot of this information. But, you know, law enforcement, there's the article citation. You know, law enforcement only comes in at the end of the game, right? Law enforcement really only comes in once a kid has gone missing. And so much has already happened by the time law enforcement gets called. We certainly are responsible for doing our jobs once we are called. And in the Marshal Service, we definitely do our very best to do that. But so much has happened prior to that. And then let's say we recover a kid, we put the kid back in their tribal community, law enforcement's not involved anymore. And so as somebody who sits in law enforcement, in a law enforcement agency that works on missing child cases, I want to make sure that the focus doesn't get taken off of this public health approach to preventing kids from going missing in the first place, that we focus on that healing, and that we focus on that healing for individuals, for families and communities, so that there's less need to reach out to law enforcement. And then we in the law enforcement field will continue to try to improve our responses. We'll continue to try to improve the willingness of state and local agencies to respond to missing child cases, and that it has to be a both-and approach for it to work. So this is the citation for our article. It's available online. It's free. This PowerPoint, organizers, feel free to distribute the PowerPoint. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, try to get out of this. There we go. And I know we blew through a lot of information, but I also know it's getting to late afternoon and nap time out there. So I just want to open it up for any questions for myself or for Sarah. You know, we're happy to field anything and you know, tell you what we know.
Isn't there a way to like implement better training programs for police officers
Oh yeah, absolutely.
so that they recognize these things more? And
Yeah, definitely. You know, that's part of what we're doing on the law enforcement side, is trying to not only train officers on how to investigate missing child cases in the first place, provide, you know, it's colloquially called like cultural competence training for working in Indian country, working in tribal communities, but also there's training on, you know, spotting indicators of, you know, say trafficking or indicators that a kid may be at risk. So all that training is out there. We usually can't force it, and that's the hitch, right? Is it like, let's say you've got a local PD in Arizona. If they don't want to investigate missing child cases and they don't want to do the training, like, we can't make them. And that's where the hitch comes in.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions here? In person? No? Billy, are there any questions online? Or Barry, if you can see if there's questions from your end.
Let me see.
Alrighty, I guess there's no questions online either. If we get any in, I'll email you, Lori, and thank you so much for your presentation. It was great to see the updated numbers for 2023. That's definitely something that's new, so we'll go take a look at those stats. Thank you very much. If we
Thank
can
you
give
so
them a
much.
round of applause. Thank you.